Um, yeah, so welcome everyone to the latest webinar by Ware. So today I'll be going through the automation testing with the Jest and Cypress libraries. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which we all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of New South Wales. Yeah, so throughout this webinar, I just want to have a talk, a bit of a chat about the importance of automation testing. Why it's so important, even though it seems to be one of the first steps that's always skipped or cut when it comes to time constraints. I want to talk a little bit about how to write effective tests and a little bit of best practices. And then I also want to run through, how you can use, or how I've been able to use ChatGPT over the last couple of weeks, just in order to make my tests, like writing of the tests, a lot faster than it normally would take. So kind of automating the boring stuff. So automation testing, I'm sure everyone here has some idea about testing, but just to go over it a little bit more, having tests written up programmatically can save a lot of time when it comes to making sure there's no bugs in an application. So, when it comes to running these tests, it's much better to have them run automatically whenever a bit of code is changed, rather than having to do them by hand. It allows developers working on the same project to follow the same coding standards, within reason. It prevents code that sort of works on my machine from breaking the production due to like an untested push to production. It can serve as documentation of what you expect the code, the behavior of the code to be. So you should be easily able to see the workflow of the business rules through the tests. It allows future developers to refactor your code and make sure they're following those exact same business rules. And they also make me a little bit happy when I see little red lights turn into green when the tests go from failing to passing. So this is a little bit of I have a hot take on the testing pyramid. So normally you'll hear the testing pyramid saying that, you want lots and lots of unit tests because they're cheap, easy to run. You want slightly less integration tests because they're slightly harder to do and become a little bit more brittle. And then you want the UI and end-to-end tests to be the smallest amount, just because of how much they rely on very different pieces of code, and any one of those pieces changing sort of breaks the end-to-end tests. You'll hear a lot about people complaining that end-to-end tests don't really, unit tests don't really cover enough, and you should be focusing more on integration testing. I'm a little bit of the opinion that the unit tests and integration tests can kind of be the same thing. It just depends how you're writing them. So like a unit test or a component test, they should test like a single bit of like a single function or a single component. So for example, a button. And then an integration test should test how that button is being used on a specific page. And then the end-to-end test should basically be how the user is expected to go through all of the pages to like allow their user story, essentially. So first off, I'm going to start with Jest. Just here's a little example that I've put together that tests like a user service. So we want to have at the top here, we have a describe, and it's describing the user service. So normally should encapsulate these. So you can use multiple different describes inside one another to tell whoever's running the test a bit more context about it. So you kind of want to describe what you are testing. So we're testing the user service. We have a variable in here for the user service that is being set before each new test. So before each user service, we're resetting the user service. And down the bottom with the it should add a new user. It's synonymous with the same as test. So you can say, test this or it this. You kind of want that to be descriptive of what you're trying to test. And you only want to be testing what you were describing. So for example, it should add a new user. The test should only go through and actually say, okay, we are creating a user, putting it into the user service, and then testing that the user service contains that new user. We have the down the bottom, the expect user service.users to contain new user. So with the expect, that's basically checking the value at the end of the test. So it says, okay, check that all of these users inside of the user service. So that's like a variable that we don't know actually is the value of at the moment. And we expect it to contain the new user that we created. So we do know what the new user is. So, if you're building the test using TDD, which is test-driven development, you would essentially want this test to fail initially. And as you fix up the code, this should then pass later on. It's also, you're also able to do expect.not to sort of flip that case to test any failures. So when there's like a validation failure, you don't want it to be adding in that particular user. So some of the best practices that I've found, while working at various different companies, code coverage is a buzzword that shouldn't be the priority. So a lot of places say, oh, we have 99% code coverage. We're covering every single bit of code, and we can tell that the tests are hitting these bits of code, but it doesn't actually mean that you've got meaningful tests. So, for example, if you're creating a new user, say that you have a user using like a Arabic character, and you haven't sort of covered for that. The code coverage will still say, hey, it's checking the input and seeing if it can add the user, but having that context of the meaningful text is a lot more useful. Again, the name of the test should describe what the test is actually doing. So if it's not in the description, it shouldn't really be in the test. And that also means that the description should be simple, and therefore you kind of know what is going on in the test, and you're not having to go through 100 lines of different things, of different areas that it could be failing on. It's important to use realistic fixtures. So that kind of means if you're testing like a new user being added, you kind of want it to be reflective of what you expect to be going in. So it's much better to use johndoe@email.com.au rather than abc123 at test bbb, just spamming inside of that text box, unless of course you're testing if it's going to fail. But having that simplicity makes it a little bit, and that realism makes it a bit easier to understand. More simple, less complex. That kind of means you want your test to be easy to understand, and you kind of want it to be explicit. So having things like for loops inside of a test to say, hey, loop through each one of these values and then have a like an expect to test if that value is correct is not the best way to do it. It's much better to just go through 10 different ways and just say, expect this, expect this, expect this. It just makes it a lot easier to read, and it means that if the code fails, you know exactly where it's going to be failing. Using fail test cases is also really, really good. They're just as good as using a pass one. So you kind of want to make sure that your code is not breaking when somebody puts in something unexpected. So coming up with a lot of these fail test cases is usually really, really helpful. And lastly, mocking external dependencies is really, really good. So you kind of want your tests to be in isolation. If you can't control, a bit of code, then it should be mocked. So if it's outside of your code, then it should be mocked. Your code should be able to be repeated multiple times and pass or fail every single time, rather than depending on some outside area. And that's sort of more to do with unit tests, but it can be also to do with integration tests. So for example, you have a login page that uses a button. You have an integration test that tests that you can actually write into a login form and click the button, but you don't need to be testing the authorization, like the auth API, to see if it's coming back correctly or not. You kind of want to mock that response call. Next, moving on to end-to-end tests. So with Cypress, it's a little bit different because it reads an entire HTML and JavaScript page. So you kind of want everything to be built in together. It's kind of like the end case when it comes to, after integration tests. So again, we have the same sort of style of, describing what you're testing. We have another before each, so it's visiting as the home page every time it's starting up a new test. We have an it with the description of what it should be testing, so it should create a new user. And as we go through this, it's saying that it's using the Cypress library to get a specific attribute. So in this case, we've got data-cy, and that'll be named, add user button, username input, and submit button. So you basically get those HTML attributes. We're running a click on the add user button. We're typing in the John Doe name into the username input, and then we're clicking the submit button toward the end. To validate the test, we have a data-cy user list. So we're getting that attribute, and we're saying it should contain John Doe. These are just HTML selectors. So again, it's much better to be really, really specific when it comes to these. And this kind of follows the best practices that Cypress puts out. You should actually be using data-cy as the best case scenario. And you should try not to be using generics like classes or just inputs or buttons. And sometimes it's not great to be using IDs, because they can very easily change. And as soon as they change in the code, then that's going to break all of your tests. So, going on to best practices, again, use the data-cy attributes. On the right-hand side, we've got, this is a nice little table that Cypress adds in for, illustration of when you should be using these type of selectors. Setting up custom commands. This is kind of like when you have a repetitive bit of code, you kind of want to automate this. So instead of typing out, get the user input, get the password input, click the button, check that they've logged in, you can put that all inside a custom command, have that defined as a chainable bit of code, and then you can call that at any one of your tests. So if you're using it multiple times, it's good to have it in a custom command. Variables also don't work in Cypress. So if you have a const, a let, or a var for a variable, it doesn't actually persist throughout the test. So because this is running in a headless system. So instead, you want to be using a Cypress, so cy.get and get whatever you're trying to find, and then you use .as and you give it a name. Whatever you need to reuse that that alias name, you do cy.get and you have @ and then whatever that name is. So for example, cy.get a as links, and then you would use that as cy.get @ links.first.click, for example. Lonely tests. So again, like unit tests and integration tests, you want to be testing in isolation. So if you can't control it, you want to be mocking it, and you don't want your tests to be relying on each other. If one test up the pipeline fails, you don't want it to be failing the rest of them. They should all be in isolation. So if one fails, it shouldn't affect the rest of them. And lastly, you should be cleaning your environment before testing rather than after you run a test. So that basically means if you have two different tests, they change the database. If you skip the first one and that has a cleaning at the end, so if you're saying reset the database at the end of the test, if you skip that test, then the second test would not have like a clean environment. So you can't really rely on that test. So it's much better to use before each or before all rather than after each or after all. Yeah, so I'm going to bring up just my VS Code. Oops, that's too far. And I've just put together a bit of an example of, like an example project that we can run a few of these tests in. So for this login spec, let me just open up the application. Do you need me to zoom in at all, or? I assume that's a no. Okay, so we have a default application. We have like a login page. It doesn't allow you to log in until it has like a mock database, so it doesn't actually work. Login fails if you don't have the correct username. That says 2 1 to 2. That was it. Okay, so it allows you to log in based on that mock database call. So if I log out now, go back to the test, you see that I've got basically setting up the fixtures and the component at the start. So that's running in a before each. And then we've got a bunch of these different tests to say, okay, we want to see that the component actually creates. We want to see that it initializes with default values. And we want to see if it works when we type in a specific value. So the great thing about Jest is that you can actually run these tests in isolation straight off the page. So for example, I can click run here and that will open up the terminal. And it's only run that specific test. So this is also why that description of the test is really important. We can see that it's testing the logging component and it should do this. It doesn't actually tell you what the code is doing. So if you're running this externally, you're not really going to know what is happening unless you look at the code. So keep the description simple. All right. So one of the cool things I found with ChatGPT, if anyone's used it, it's really, really good if you are able to actually paste in code, and you can get it to write your tests as long as it's sort of documented for you. So I'm going to copy this onto ChatGPT. Selecting GPT-4 as a software developer, write tests for the following I've just pasted that entire bit of code in here. Let me just grab the HTML as well. And it basically can output, the tests for me, or at least do a lot of the grunt work for me. So this kind of allows me to, just take this bit of code that it's actually putting together and, just validate that is correct. Okay, so it's trying to use Jasmine. Let me just update that and say using write tests using Jest following Angular components. And submit. Let's just get that to restart. So this is also why documentation is really important. So because AI definitely seems to be the future of where programming is going. It's not that it's going to be like it's going to take everyone's jobs immediately. It's just going to become, first off, a tool so you can speed up your workload. So having good documentation alongside your code makes the AI generation of this of this test code a lot more precise. So as it's going on, let's just and yeah, then it even explains what it is doing and why it's doing that. All right, so let's just check if this works. I'm going to take full service mock status. Take this bit of code, move it over to the a new login component spec, and again, I'm not assuming that this is going to work straight out of the box. It's always good to read through it first and double check that it's working. But now just going to click run on it and see how it goes, and then fix up any errors as it comes up. All right. So it's passed a few of them, but it's saying, okay, it should call the login method when the form's submitted. So it can't read the property of undefined when reading to subscribe. So what is that? That would be on the component.login. Form subscribes to this, but it doesn't actually return what that login is. So it should expect a auth-service.login observable to have been called. Subscribe. Okay, so it's actually this part that's failing. Yeah, anyway, like I'm going to leave that debugging for a little bit after, just because, you know, I don't want to spend the entire time trying to fix up these little bugs. But it's just insane, like what this can actually do and how this can kind of speed up what you want to be doing. So I'm just going to create a new component. ngg component GPT. Okay, so I've got a GPT test. This is completely fresh. I'm going to write in here a few comments of what I want it to do. We should form input box label and placeholder. We should then so this is auto-completing for me because I've got Gitlab Copilot on as well. So again, using AI to speed up a lot of this code process. Okay, so okay, so we have set up the input box with the label and a placeholder of chat here. On click of a submit button, submit the form, and then on form submit, show an alert with the text. Okay, so I'm going to copy this, take this back into ChatGPT. A new chat, GPT-4. Right. So this is essentially going through at the moment, now writing up the HTML for it. Afterwards, it will go through setting up the component file. And I can actually ask it to adjust the form as I'm going through. So basically, this is using like an ID for the chat form, ng form. I kind of want it to be using like a reactive form. So I'll get it to update afterwards. Got ng form, got the component. Got a variable for the chat text, writing out the on submit function. It runs the alert based on that document, those comments that I had. And then it sort of describes what it's doing and why it's doing it that way. Okay, so update the component to use. Update the component to use reactive forms. And again, it's going to go through that HTML and that component file and just update that for me. It's not always 100% correct, but the fact that it's getting a lot of the structure and just the grunt work done for me is just mind-blowing, or at least to me. Okay, so it's even added in here saying, hey, with the module file, make sure you're including the reactive forms. So that's not even something I asked it to remember to do. It creates a form group for the chat form, got the chat text with a required validator. And now it's updating the HTML code for me. It even tells us what it's removed and what it's replaced it with. And lastly, I'm going to ask it to generate a test using Jest. Using the above, write a written in Jest. Gives us link with how to set up Jest. It's just assuming that we don't have it set up already. Imports the reactive forms modules so that it doesn't throw an error when you're trying to run it. And it gives it descriptive names of what the test should be. So it should show an alert with the submitted text on a valid form submission. Now, I don't like how it's used the debug element.query and then trying to find it that way to get like the actual element. And this is sort of where you would use this code as like a template and then go through and update it yourself and just make sure it's the correct style and using the best practices. It even tells you why you shouldn't be using window.alert, as it can be intrusive and difficult to test. Now, it's better to use a custom UI component or library for displaying notifications. So yeah, it's really, really helpful having this stuff generated for you. And just using it as that boilerplate means that you can write up your tests for your components as long as they're documented correctly, a lot faster than it would be writing it all out by hand. All right. And just quickly go back to the slideshow. I lastly just want to finish up with how to sort of automate these tests in a pipeline. So for example, GitLab or GitHub. You'll have a YAML file that you can essentially attach to your project. So, for example, this one's displaying gitlab-ci.yaml. Whenever you push up your code onto GitLab, it will check this YAML file and then follow the instructions that is actually written in there. So you actually want to be building your application whenever you're pushing it up, or, for example, merging it together with somebody else's and getting it ready for staging. You want it to then be running a list of tests, and you want these to be run in parallel so it runs a lot faster. if possible. And you should only allow the merging of that code if those tests are passing. So this means that you can set up tests, have your application working, and then 1 year later, another dev might come on, not understand what they're doing, make a mistake. These tests will then validate and make sure that they're not pushing up dodgy code onto production. Yeah, so you can find out a lot more of these on the GitHub and GitLab docs. I've also got a list of links I'll be able to share in the chat just after this, if anyone's more interested. And yeah, very highly recommend using ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot to automate a lot of this automation. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Did you have any questions?
Hi, Brett. It's Mason here. I just had one question. So, in a complex scenario, like, do you suggest to write a test for each and every scenario, or?
Yeah. So this kind of comes back to again, code coverage and having those meaningful tests. So again, you want the test to be simple. So you want like lots of little unit tests to test out the functionality, but you want to make sure that they are actually meaningful to what you want to be doing. So prioritize the ones that are, a lot more important than just testing whether it, renders or whether it comes out blue. When it comes to sort of testing everything, there's a bit of a balance. As long as you have, your core pieces of, code, like with automated tests, it usually is enough. And then you can have some edge cases that you should try to cater for, but they're slightly less important just because, of time constraints.
Yep.
And, you can't test every single, character that's inside of your code. So always just try to prioritize what you can and then test as much as you can. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
Right, sweet. Yep, Joseph.
Thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for the presentation. Just wanted to get a bit more about how you. So you're showing us Jest right now. How are you implementing Cypress to do some of the component testing?
Did I totally forget to go through that? Let me just. Am I still sharing the screen? I think I am, right? Yeah. So Cypress end-to-end tests. I've got that in a separate folder outside of my Angular source. You can have this set up to have, your tests. You should have your tests in individual files. So what I've got here is, user login.cy.ts. It describes my user login end-to-end test, and it should log in with the valid credentials. So we essentially visit the login page, we get the email, we get the password, and we're typing in the email, typing in the password, clicking the login button, and then checking that it's taking us to the new URL. So in running this, you can use npx Cypress run, and that will run in like a headless browser. So basically means that it's running those tests, in the background. You can also use Cypress Open, and that will open up like a UI where you can actually go through and look at the tests that you're doing. One of the wonderful things about Cypress that I'm very, very glad that you picked up on, because it can actually take screenshots and videos of itself conducting the tests. So we can see here that it's got a video and it's outputting to an MP4 file. Let me just open up this file. We've got it here, and we can see it running through those tests. So So it does it very quickly just because it's automated. You can actually get it to slow down in the configuration. But as I go through here, it's typing in, it's clicking that login button, and then should very quickly be able to see it actually get to that home page. You'll be able to see it up the top here. Up. It's very difficult to see. Hang on, let's see if I can slow it down. Where is it? Cypress config. Just quickly Google this. This is always good to do. The compression goes through spec result, create the video, delete the video. Maybe there's not a default setting just for the speed. That's unfortunate. Anyway, it's still the fact that you can do this very easily. You can have these videos set up so it records automatically. You can also get it to record screenshots. So by passing it into that into like the automated CI pipeline, you can get it to compare previous screenshots to the most current screenshots. And that will actually do like a pixel by pixel comparison. So if you're not changing any of the designs, you would expect it to work. And if that comes up failing, you can have it failing on those specific screenshot tests as well. NPX Cypress. Okay, so this is opening up the UI with the NPX Cypress open. Got the end-to-end tests. Get it to open in Chrome. And we can see all of our list of tests inside of here. And we can debug the tests as we go through as well, if we need. So I can click on that user login test, get it to run again. And see that it's logged in, and it's actually showing the GPT Angular logged in page with the logout button at the top. So you can do it through the UI or straight in the command prompt if you need. Does that answer your question, Joseph?
Yep. Just another thing with the with Cypress, like, have you done it with different like viewports, like with the mobile viewport and stuff like that?
Yeah,
or...
yeah. So you can set those inside of the Cypress config. So I believe viewport height, viewport width. You can set that to be, whatever you need it to be, and you can actually go through and create environment variables. So when you want to be testing mobile, you can set that to a specific height and width. Same with like a small laptop or an iPad. And you can do that through, again, that config. You can say env. This is a object inside of here, and you can say viewport height, viewport width. That, for example. So then when you run it with the environment of mobile, which you can do in the terminal, you can get it to run those specifics. So let me just save this and see if it's actually automatically fixed it up in the Cypress UI. End-to-end tests. Settings. By settings. Okay, I might need to restart it. Get that to work. There's a whole list of different like settings that you can use inside of that's documented on the Cypress website. It's really easy to go onto there and have a look through them. For example, let's say environment variables. Set the environment variable to that specific one. What? You can also set them inside of the YAML file if you need it for Docker to sort of override them. And that the use the .env. Is it? I want to use them there, yeah. Right, they've got like a an example project somewhere. Yeah, the real world app. So inside of here, they've got their Cypress folder where they have all of their tests. They have a Cypress config. And inside of that config, they've got a mobile viewport, various different fresh token areas, when component.
But you just passed. Was that in the end-to-end?
Yeah, so I'll send a couple of links in the chat, just so you guys can have a look through it yourself. Just because it'll take a while for me to sort of look through it, just because I can't remember exactly where they are.
And just one more question: have you had so Jess was with the the component side of things. Have you had a look at the Cypress component testing? Like, is there any difference with it? Or
I have a little bit. I'm still using Jest for the sheer fact that they only really completed the Angular component testing recently. So I think I was trying it at the end of last year, and it was still a little bit buggy, especially when we were using what was it? We were like using Stencil to then export out to Angular. I tried to use it in the Angular export, and it relied on a bunch of packages. So I haven't done too much research into it over the last couple of months. I'm sure it's probably updated, and it's very easy to use. Jest is still probably the default, just because of how slim it is. So the reason why you would use Jest rather than Karma or Jasmine, which is like the built-in Angular one, is because you don't want to have to get it to compile all of the code to run it. You just want to be able to run it based on a single file. And I think that's especially where Jest excels. Hopefully one day Cypress will catch up to that, and maybe it has already, but at the moment I'm not sure how far ahead it's gotten. Awesome. All right, thanks guys.
Bye.